It was an attempt to do something I hadn't seen people doing before, which is to look at not just certain genres or certain trends like, say, film noir, but rather to look at sort of a whole set of craft conventions that filmmakers had that they could draw on for really any genre or any trend. So, for instance, what you find when you look at, if you think of film noir, okay, voiceover, flashbacks, problematic protagonists, but then you start to look at other genres and you find the same thing, that these techniques were pretty widespread and that people almost seem to be competing in ways to innovate within those techniques, almost in a kind of, if not a show-offish fashion, at least in a sense that they're making the movies for other filmmakers as much as they're making them for audiences, which I think does bring the auteur issue in, but in a way that maybe has not been emphasized as much. Plus, there are so many books on auteurs of the 40s, as there are genres of the 40s. It wasn't clear to me I could contribute a lot in that dimension, but I do think that we get a different perspective on the most significant filmmakers when we understand that sort of backdrop, or let's say the menu that they're working with, the choices that they're making, so that we, one of the things that came interestingly out for me was that we think of Hitchcock and his films of the 40s very much as expressions of the Hitchcock vision of the world or whatever. But actually, in a way, Hitchcock has sort of set a certain standard for one of the genres, the thriller. And then he had to look around and see that other people are competing with him. And other people are turning out these, quote, Hitchcockian thrillers. And even the critics are calling them Hitchcockian thrillers. Right. And so what does the individual filmmaker do when suddenly they're in a race? A kind of escalation with these other filmmakers. And interestingly, Hitchcock tries to do different things. If you think about a film like Under Capricorn, or even a film like Rope or Lifeboat, you see him saying, okay, I'm not going to give people what they expect. I'll give them Notorious, but then I'm going to give them something else that I can tweak those other things with the Hitchcock touch. And of course, for him, it was partly a matter of setting himself, as you said, a very distinct formal problem. How do I make a movie in a single locale? Or how do I make a movie with very, very long takes, as in Under Capricorn and Rope, and so on. So there's a sense in which I think we understand auteurism better when we see them, individual creators, in the context of what the creative options are that are themselves changing rapidly. I mean, one of the most exciting things to me about the 40s is that these things are just turning on a dime. I mean, people come out with Citizen Kane, and then like a year, 2 years later, everybody is trying these various techniques. Not all from Citizen Kane, but certainly can be referenced to it. And the other thing I think that's important is that there's a lot of money to be made. In a way, and you touched on this, it was hard to lose money in the 40s with a film. It really was. They managed to do it by the end of the decade. They definitely managed to do it. And David O. Selznick probably did it better than anybody. But nevertheless, you could really just kind of pump this stuff out there. And the audience was happy to take it, which meant that you could try lots of different things. If you think of the great age of the B film, it is the 1940s. It's partly because B films had that kind of swagger. They could count on an audience, watching their movie. So to me, that whole context is so exciting because it puts auteurism in the frame of kind of competition, cooperation among these filmmakers and trying to push the boundaries of what they can say and how they can say it.
What really interests me about this question about what might be the intersection between narrative structures and performance styles is partly, the question of, did things like voiceover and these flashback structures lead actors or require actors to be acting in a different way, as well as something else you write about really well in the book, all the emphasis on subjectivity and psychology that came into 40s films, which is something I've thought a lot about and wrote a lot about, particularly in the context of noir. But, I'd never really thought about this before, but, when I was just thinking about this before our conversation today, suddenly thought, that kind of impassive style that becomes very important in the 40s. I mean, that again, we associate mostly with noir, but appears in other ways, this kind of, everything being sort of internalized and this almost sort of sleepwalking, sort of dreamy style, makes a lot of sense if, you're an actor and that there's actually going to be a voiceover, whether it's your voiceover or somebody else, describing some kind of interior subjective state. You don't really want to also be enacting that state with a lot of facial acting, or it would become very redundant.
Oh, I think that's really neat. I think that's a really neat idea, and very true. I think what you find, I tried to characterize it a couple points, but again, I didn't really emphasize it probably enough. In a way, what you get with most 1930s performances, you might call behavioral acting, where everything is external. I'm not saying it's hammy necessarily, though it can be, but rather it's just a sense that you'd be able to just read off the characters' mental states, typically not just even through their face, because 30s actors really know how to use their bodies, the stance, the way they shift their weight, gesture, everything, necks, everything. But in the 40s, I completely agree with you. I think there is a kind of new interiority and a kind of neutralization of the acting performance that's intense, almost silent film style. And one of the themes of the book, as you know, is the idea that a lot of silent cinema comes back in the 40s. Right. But you think of Joan Crawford, or almost any of the major actors, not so much Cary Grant maybe, but Stewart, for instance, and how these medium shots focusing on these actors with voiceovers or subjective monologues kinds of things, they don't have to do that much, but they're very intense. They're staring, and you're staring at them as you're hearing this. You know, it's a different kind of relationship we have to the performer than we do with, say, Carole Lombard in 20th Century with John Barrymore, where everything is externalized.
Right. I mean, I'm often struck, particularly with Hollywood films of the early 30s, by the sense of it almost being like people don't have interior psychology. There's never that kind of focus on people's, internal states or their problems. It's, it's all about the world outside them. And then in the 40s, suddenly it's all about what's going on inside.
That's neat, because it correlates the idea that in the 30s, you have almost a kind of social conditions mechanism for causal change. That is, what makes somebody a gangster or maybe a society girl? Yeah,
is sick or is neurotic.
That's right. It's
and then
all
in the
out
40s,
there, and you get infected.
People are isolated. There's no sense of them belonging to a larger society. But
and they're figuring it all out as they go through. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, I think.
Actors are also being called upon to, enact dreams. You talk also wonderfully about dream sequences, or to express, these different layers of time. I'm really interested in the depiction of time on film, and how, as an actor, do you do that flashback thing where you're going into somebody's memories? So,
no, I think that's right. There's a way in which even there's one strain that runs through the 40s that kind of continues the 30s behavioralism, I think. And you might think of it in terms of the ordinary films, and made by classic directors like Hawks or Ford, or even some of the Minnellis like Meet Me in St. Louis, where it's quite externalized. But then you get a performance like Judy Garland's in Meet Me in St. Louis, where suddenly it is completely interiorized. There's no flashback, there's no voiceover, but you're staring at this woman. You're watching someone think. How often do you get to watch somebody think in a 1930s film? And so that sense, I think you're right on target with that. There's a way in which, by the 40s, they're rethinking narrative and thinking, okay, if we have subjective narratives, then we've got these very sensitive vessels, these characters who are really quite alert to all kinds of things in their environment. Maybe we can downplay traditional acting, gestures and so forth, and just let the audience soak that in, soak that quality of their thoughtfulness or their fear or whatever that emotion is in a very intimate kind of way. I think that is tied to it. And in fact, it does, then you have these sort of superstructures like memory, flashbacks, and fantasies and things like that, kind of just reinforcing that interiority. 30s cinema is theatrical in a certain way, because it's about behavior that can be displayed, interactions that can be shown. 40 cinema becomes, in many respects, not completely, but exactly the way you're talking about it, becomes more novelistic. It's more, many of these films are trying for that density of present, past, future that we get in novels. You see it in films like, well, obviously in Ambersons, which the Henry Jamesian kind of quality to these films, where there's almost a sense that there's something that's happened here that we're not going to see, but we're going to see everybody react to. But you get it also, I think, in films where you don't expect it. I think you get it, for instance, in one of my favorites of the 40s, which is Daisy Kenyon.
Ooh, me too.
Where I mean, I'm looking back at my book, because I've been afraid to read it, actually. I went back and looked at it today, and I have all this stuff on Daisy Kenyon. I thought,
Yes,
what made me do
you have
this?
a long discussion of that.
But the thing is, it's because you can't figure these people out. What the hell is wrong with these people? I mean, there's not a sane one in the bunch, you know? And they're contradictory from scene to scene. It's not just Henry Fonda. He's not just a wounded vet. Daisy's crazy, and the Dana Andrews character's crazy. I mean, they're all kind of nuts on each other, and you're trying to figure out, what do these people want? What are they trying to do to each other? And it's all those kinds of stratagems and cross purposes you get in a novel. And by the way, these are not in the novel. The Elizabeth Janeway novel does not do this.
Absolutely breaking the rules about, you know, characters having clear motivations, having somebody who's clearly sympathetic, whom you identify with. There's really everyone in the film is really ambivalent, really screwed up, you know.
And to me, this is not Eugene O'Neill's psychodrama. This is really like a novel that's trying to probe these very, and partially seen. I mean, this is where, as you say, narrative structure and narration come in. Because if we had a single protagonist, if it was all about Daisy and we only saw Daisy all the time, then we'd understand it. But we don't. We're skipping among these three characters and getting glimpses of what they do. And to try to assemble these pieces of their actions into a coherent whole is very difficult.
And it's also about the performance style, too. I mean, all those performances are great. And they're all actors who are totally capable of being ambiguous and ambivalent and you know, evoking these contradictory responses from you, where, you know, Dana Andrews is so charming and at the same time he's so sleazy and
honey
you know,
bunch. What does that come from? You know, calling everybody honey bunch. What does that mean? You know, no, the thing. But you're right about, to go back to your original point. That is, and there's always something about the past in these things. Their past relationships or things that are skipped over. Like Daisy suddenly marries the Henry Fonda character. Why? It happens off screen. It's gone. Now, maybe it's one of those things that gets elided because of production circumstances or whatever, but the result is still very interesting, more interesting than if we'd had a lot of internal explanation. Again, the denial of voiceover is important in that film, too. So, I mean, there's a way in which exactly what you're saying about this time thing, it springs out of, I think, what we think of as, quote, novelistic traits, like characterization, depth, a multiplicity of viewpoints, a certain critical relationship on the part of the reader, viewer, to what's happening. Those things emerge more saliently in the 40s.
There's a general assumption that whatever is visual is cinematic, and anytime it's dialogue or voiceover or sound is somehow less cinematic, but that there can be a way for even voiceover to be used in a cinematic way, where when it creates a kind of distinct kind of sound that becomes part of the atmosphere and the mood of the movie. And, you know, that's what really works in something like Out of the Past or, you know, Force of Evil, or something where the voiceover almost becomes like a score. You know, it's really functioning almost in a musical way.
Yeah, this ties in again to this novelistic thrust, because once you have a voice either of a character displaced in time or a character's mind or a non-character narrator, you add a layer to the movie that can benefit the movie or not, obviously, depending on how it's used. But I think of how all these things tie together in films that we're showing actually at MoMI this weekend. For instance, Letter to Three Wives, which is kind of virtuoso in this respect, because there you've got a narrator who's a character but who's never seen.
Right.
You know, and she's providing a whole different perspective on what you're seeing, as if she's watching the movie along with us. You know, she's commenting on their gestures and things like this. Like, this is kind of crazy, but she's this kind of voice of God, but she's in the story world. She knows, you know, what's going on. And that kind of playfulness is perfectly permissible as far as I'm concerned. I mean, just stretching those conventions, and voiceover then becomes very useful. Or you think of somebody nowadays like Wong Kar-wai, he couldn't make a movie without voiceover, it seems to me. I mean, because with him, that voice, that's the glue that holds the whole thing together. All these moments of powerful impressions, they need some sort of, you know, flow, and that's what the voiceover gives them. So it becomes a kind of floating soundtrack that becomes quite rich poetically. But all these things, I think, are already emerging in the 40s. Now, one thing I should say, if anyone bothers to listen to this, is that much of what I'm saying is not absolutely unique to or original with the 40s. That what I'm trying to argue is that these things are kind of there piecemeal in Hollywood cinema before the 40s, but they get consolidated and then expanded and kind of go nuts and wild in the 40s. So for instance, we do find some few films with voiceovers in the 30s, and we find films with flashbacks and replays, and the very end of the 30s, you have some psychoanalytic dramas and things like that. But it's really in the 40s where there's so much money to be made and so many people striving to make, their own things, to do innovative cinema, that it becomes kind of a crushed together. It explodes, I guess I'd say.
Because I mean, these are the attempt to make cinema psychological. You can see that in early experimental films like The Smiling Madame Bidet,
absolutely,
for instance. And it's not like people just all of a sudden were like, "Hey, why don't we insert this thing?" It's like the form was developing, and obviously technology played a huge component of that, and having reliable sound and having So it is
cyclical almost, or
yes.
a way.
Yeah.
Something.
It's an interesting point, because you have something like Smiling Madame Bidet or Les Glaces à Trois Faces trying to be the subjective, but not even in the 20s and 30s would you have something really like Lady in the Lake.
Right.
I mean, Lady in the Lake is a good example. I'm not saying it's a great movie, but somebody had to make it.
Yes.
Somebody had to
Someone
do that.
had to try.
Well, another great example, and this actually is a film that is screening at MoMA, I think this coming Friday, a film from the early 30s, which of course you do cite in the book, but The Sin of Nora Moran, which
movie.
Is one of the most incredibly ambitious and ahead of its time movies of the early 30s. Poverty Row, no big stars, but it has the most complex flashback structure, flashbacks within flashbacks. It keeps shifting.
It's almost all stock footage too.
The perspective keeps shifting between, one person's telling the story and then you're in somebody else's head, but it's unclear if these things are all kind of like one inside the other, or you're just kind of drifting around.
Did I just dream that?
And then there are
I'm
these
still in your dream.
fascinating flashbacks in which, so that this woman who's on death row is looking back on her life and how she got there. But in the flashbacks, she knows what's going to happen. And she's saying, well, if I don't go to the door, this, what's going to happen won't happen. And so it's not just a flashback. It's like her reliving her life. And the only other film I can think of that has something sort of like that is Repeat Performance, where again you have, and that is a 40s film where someone is going back but having to relive her life in an attempt to make it turn out differently. So it's this strange use of flashbacks.
There it's almost a fantasy premise, because she just magically gets transported back a year and lives her life again. Whereas with Nora Moran, as you say, you were plunged into these layers of awareness about the past and the future that seemed like completely unrealistic. I mean, just how could you know all this stuff? No, you're right. That's a fascinating example, and a good example of how crazy you could be in a B film, because you just had to pump something out there. And there are others. I mean, The Life of Virgie Winters is a much more contained example, but there you do have almost a Citizen Kane structure of a dead man and a woman recalling what she knew of him and so on. So there are, other cases. It's just that in the 40s, these became higher on the menu. They were more on the agenda.